Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our third and final day of our 2022 virtual Dairy Day. I am Lindsay Ferlito, one of the two regional dairy specialists with Cornell Cooperative Extension's North Country Regional Ag Team. I'm joined today by my colleague, Casey Havicus, and then we have three great talks today focusing on animal welfare and industry sustainability. So our first talk today is from Alycia Drwencke. She is a PhD student at the University of California, Davis, and she's going to be talking to us today about some best management practices related to disbudding in calves.
Thank you, Lindsay and Casey, for the invitation to speak. I am really looking forward to talking to you all about some considerations for dairy calf disbudding. And I just wanted to let you all know that I'm speaking to you today as a PhD student at the University of California, Davis, and my research is focused on pain and wound healing after caustic paste disbudding. And I want to acknowledge two of my collaborators, Dr. Cassandra Tucker and Dr. Sarah Adcock, both for their contributions to my current work, as well as their contributions to this slide deck and their overall efforts to further our knowledge surrounding disbudding. So kind of what I'm hoping to cover with you all today is what we're seeing as current industry approach, what we know about disbudding, both for hot iron as well as caustic paste, and then some considerations for best practice. So jumping into current practice, at least in the United States, we see that more than 9 out of 10 dairies perform either disbudding or dehorning. And this is based on NAM survey data that most of you have probably heard of at some point or another. So when we look more specifically at what form of disbudding is being used, we see that about 70% of farms have been utilizing hot iron disbudding both in 2007 and 2014. Looking at caustic paste, we've seen an increase over time to about 16% of farms utilizing this form of disbudding in 2014. And then for scoop dehorning, we've seen a decrease between 2007 and 2014, down to about 30%. And when we look at the age of disbudding and when farms are performing this, it's often correlated with the method of disbudding that they're using. So typically we'll see that farms are utilizing caustic paste in the first week of life. Hot iron is being utilized within the first 8 weeks of life, and then scoop dehorning is often performed after 8 weeks of life. Another component that we can look at for current practice is the percent of farms that are utilizing pain relief. So based on that NAM survey data, we've seen an increase in farms that are utilizing pain relief when they're performing hot iron disbudding. However, we've actually seen the opposite trend in terms of the percent of farms that are utilizing pain relief for caustic paste disbudding. So we actually saw farms decrease from about 14% to 6% in 2014. And I do want to acknowledge that obviously 2014 was almost a decade ago at this point. So these numbers maybe are a little bit out of date. But there has been at least a couple of recent studies that have looked at the percentage of operations utilizing pain relief on their farm. And the results that I'm going to present are for any form of disbudding. They didn't necessarily break it out between hot iron and caustic paste. So the first study was specific to Wisconsin, but probably gives us a general idea of what's happening across the country. And when asked about the percentage of farms utilizing pain relief, in Wisconsin, they found that 43% of farms were using some method of pain relief for disbudding. The survey also asked about the percentage of farms that were utilizing both an NSAID, so a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, such as meloxicam, in combination with some sort of local block, which is likely lidocaine. And they found that only about 12% of farms were using this combination of pain relief. And there has been a study that was published in 2021 that looked across the United States, and they found that about 20% of farms that were performing disbudding used some form of pain relief. So we see a few differences based on studies. However, we also see that a majority of stakeholders believe that pain relief should be utilized. So based on a survey published in 2015, 83% of producers, 92% of veterinarians, and 92% of the public believe that pain relief should be provided. And I also want to acknowledge that these studies were obviously performed prior to Farm version 4.0 going into effect, which, as I'm sure all of you know, have some pretty specific standards surrounding disbudding and pain relief. So it's likely that we'll see these statistics change over time as the farm program applies to 99% of the milk supply in the United States. So with this in mind, I'm going to kind of step away from scoop dehorning as it's less likely to be utilized on farms and just focus the rest of my talk on caustic paste and hot iron disbudding. So let's move into what we actually know about disbudding. And for both hot iron and caustic paste disbudding, we know that the hornbud tissue is damaged and to prevent growth by causing a 3rd-degree burn. And you can see in this graphic here that a 3rd-degree burn permeates the skin down to the fat layer of tissue. So then, thinking more specifically about each method, I want to first talk a little bit more about hot iron disbudding, as we know a lot more about this disbudding method. There's a lot more research available, so we just have some more conclusive answers for this method. And when we look at all of the research that has been done, we can see that calves experience pain from hot iron disbudding. And there's a few different ways that we can identify this. So after hot iron disbudding, we see that calves have an increase in cortisol, which is often referred to as a stress hormone. We see increased heart rates, and then we also see increased wound-directed behaviors. So these are things such as head shaking, head rubbing, and ear flicking. And importantly, we see that this response is mitigated or diminished when we use pain relief. So because we're seeing these increased responses that are then, they increase less severely when we provide pain relief, we can tell that the calves are experiencing pain. And it's important to note that these results are informed by more than 50 studies that have described the hot iron disbudding process and the pain that calves experience. However, what we're starting to look at more and learn more about more recently is what the calves are experiencing throughout the wound healing process. And so what we see throughout this time is that in the initial phase, we have this copper ring that forms pretty much immediately when you apply the hot iron, right? Most of you are probably pretty familiar with it. Looking for that copper ring is one way that you can tell that you've created sufficient damage to the hornbud tissue, right? Probably nothing unfamiliar. As the wound healing progresses, we see this copper ring tissue start to detach from the calf's head and lift away. Eventually, that tissue falls off, and then we're left with an initial scab and some kind of bloody tissue. From there, we kind of we see some variation in terms of scabbing as the calf has scabs form where that copper tissue fell off, and then cells migrate from the outside of the wound, filling it in, much like if you have a scab, right? And eventually, we're left with a fresh new layer of skin that's often referred to as re-epithelialized tissue. And so we see a new layer of skin in which hornbud tissue does not grow from, or hopefully doesn't grow from if your procedure is successful. And we can actually look at how long this process takes. So one study looked at calves that were disbudded between 3 and 35 days of age to identify how long this took. And what they found is that this copper ring tissue is present for about the first week. Around week 2 is when that tissue is lifting away from the calf's head. In week 3 is when we see it fall off and that initial scab form. Between weeks 4 and 8 are when we see those different secondary scabbing tissues and the scab size contracts. And then around week 9 is when this study saw that that new layer of re-epithelialized skin was present. So they concluded that wounds took 9 weeks to re-epithelialize, which is what they considered as healed. And I think it's important to note that we see this replicated across studies. So this has been done in goat kids that were disbudded between 5 and 15 days of age, calves that were disbudded between 4 and 10 days, and then the study that I just mentioned, where they were disbudded between 3 and 35 days of age. And the average for wounds to re-epithelialize across all of these studies is 7 to 9 weeks. So another way that we can identify pain is by looking at sensitivity to touch. So we can actually use a device to measure a withdrawal response and how much pressure it takes to get to that withdrawal response. So you can see this device here that we're placing against the calf's head. That is what measures the amount of pressure that we're applying to her head. And you can see that the device is placed against her head, and then the numbers slowly and steadily increase. That's the amount of pressure. And then you increase the amount of pressure until the calf responds, and you can see towards the end of the video, her head pulls away. Just there. So that can indicate to us sensitivity as well as pain. So what we see in terms of sensitivity is that calves with that wound tissue are more responsive than calves that have reached that fully healed stage. So along the bottom of this graph is those different wound tissues. And then in the blue bar here, we have that healed tissue. Our numbers are the amount of force or pressure. And the higher numbers are actually less pain as you're able to apply more force before the calf reacts. And then the lower numbers are indicative of more pain in the calves. And we see that anytime that these wound tissues are present, the calves are more sensitive and experiencing more pain than when they are fully healed. So taken together, our more than 50 studies on hot iron disbudding kind of show us that hot iron disbudding wounds take 7 to 9 weeks to heal, and they're painful throughout this time. So now let's shift a little bit to what we know about caustic paste. And I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot fewer studies focused on caustic paste disbudding. To my knowledge, there's only about 10 studies that are currently published. So there's just a lot more unknown about this method of disbudding. However, what we do know is that caustic paste is applied to the horn bud to create a chemical burn that damages the tissue and prevents horn growth. And as we saw in those surveys earlier, this method of disbudding has grown in popularity as many people believe that it's less painful or that it's easier to manage on farm than hot iron disbudding. And I do also want to acknowledge that there are some different brands of paste available. So most of the photos that I'm going to show you today have this orange paste in them. But if you or your neighbor down the road is using paste and you're like, it doesn't look like this, it may just be that it's a different brand because there's some white pastes available as well. And I think these different brands of paste are potentially one contributing factor into why we see so much variability surrounding paste use. So while it's often believed that paste can be a better method, it also seems that it's pretty susceptible to improper and inconsistent use. And one of the most frequently seen issues with paste is that too much is actually applied. And we have really large wounds resulting from too much paste applied to the calf's head. So you can see in both of these images here that the wound from the paste is exceeding far beyond where the actual horn bud tissue would be and what would need to be damaged to prevent future horn growth. Additionally, paste can create burns in extra areas on calves that we don't want. So in addition to this calf here having a pretty large wound on her head, we also see several different wounds along her ear, which you can see circled in green. Paste also can raise some concerns in social housing, as calves can rub the paste onto other animals, which can create some pretty severe damage, such as what you can see pictured on this calf's leg here. So this was a social housing setting, and they applied paste to one calf, and then she rubbed it on another pen mate and created a pretty large burn. However, something that I actually learned this summer is that there's also concerns with individually housed calves rubbing their paste as well. And I'm guessing if any of you are using paste, you probably have seen the same thing. So we applied paste to calves that were housed in hutches with outdoor pens, all individually housed. And you can see in these pictures here that the calves rub their paste onto other parts of their head all by themselves, which is obviously not ideal for a lot of different reasons. But so I think there's overall some concerns with paste getting in other places that we don't want it, regardless of housing method. And we do see some similar things that indicate pain following caustic paste disbudding based on the current research available. So we also see that after caustic paste disbudding, we see an increase in cortisol, which remember is that stress hormone. And then we also see increased wound-directed behaviors such as head shaking, head rubbing, and ear flicking. And again, we see that this response is reduced with pain relief. And I've actually seen firsthand these wound-directed behaviors increase in calves that had paste applied. So this calf was on a commercial farm, and we did not have a successful local block. Paste was applied, and you can see that within a few minutes, she begins to shake her head in this fashion and show us wound-directed behaviors. So if you're seeing this on your farm or when you're applying paste, it may indicate that your local nerve blocks are not effective. So we have a little bit of evidence for the initial pain for caustic paste, but overall, the healing process for this method of disbudding is severely understudied, and there's an overall lack of research. There has been one study that looked at the amount of time that it took for goat kids to heal after caustic paste had applied, and they found that the wounds were present for at least 6 weeks after that procedure. So that brought me to my research that I have been performing since June, is looking at how long do caustic paste wounds take to heal in dairy calves. And as kind of some preliminary work, I wanted to better understand how much paste should we actually be using, because the manufacturer instructions say that the size of a quarter should be applied, right? But to me, I don't actually know what that means. Like, how thick should it be? How thick is that quarter supposed to be? What does that actually look like in practice, right? And I'm guessing some of you had similar questions. So I actually drew the size of a quarter on a piece of paper and then measured out different paste amounts. So you can see from left to right that the amount of paste is going to increase. And after measuring out the different paste amounts, I actually applied it to the piece of paper to see what it looked like. And you can see that it looks pretty different as we increase, right? We get better coverage. It's a bit thicker when you're looking at that top image. You can actually see it coming off the paper more. And so the size of a quarter can mean probably very different things depending on what your quantity actually is that you're applying. And so based on some preliminary research that a colleague of mine did, they tried using this really low 0.05 milliliters amount, and they had some pretty disastrous results with quite a lot of horn regrowth. So based on their work, as well as being able to see the paper through the paste, I chose to not go with this amount. Instead, it appeared that this 0.25 and 0.3 milliliters had pretty good coverage And when we applied it to a test calf, it seemed that it still looked good on the calf as well. So we chose to use this amount, or these two different amounts, and we applied the 0.25 milliliters of paste to calves that weighed less than 75 pounds. And we applied that amount to each horn bud. And then calves that weighed more than 75 pounds, we applied 0.3 milliliters of paste per horn bud. Obviously, I recognize on farms, you're not going to be measuring out every little milliliter, but just to give you a sense of how much we were using. And we rubbed these amounts into unshaved horn buds. And we looked for consistent application on the unshaved horn buds. And the reason that we actually chose to go with an unshaved horn bud as opposed to a shaved horn bud, which I think most of the manufacturers recommend, is that a producer actually recommended it to us. They thought that it held the paste in place better. So we thought we'd give it a try. And so we wanted to look at the wound healing progression. And what we found is that we start out with this initial fresh, wet paste. And within 24 hours or less, we're left with this blackened, initially burned tissue. From there, that initial burn tissue actually sinks into the calf's head. So it's a little bit hard to tell in photos, but it actually becomes a pretty sunken, depressed wound. From there, we see that tissue starts to detach from the calf's head, similar to a hot iron. It eventually falls off, leaving that blood and initial scabbing. And then the progression is fairly similar to our hot iron, where we see some secondary scabbing that then begins to fill in from the edges of the wound until we're left with this re-epithelialized tissue. And we actually chose to take this wound healing process a step further and look to see how long it took to reach just a very thin scar line. So if you continue to watch the wounds, that new re-epithelialized layer will actually contract into a very thin line. And so what we found is that initially burned tissue is present for about the first week. From there, between weeks 2 and 12 is how long that kind of detaching, cracking tissue is present, where you see that initial burn trying to come off of the calf's head. Around week 12 is where it finally falls off. Between weeks 12 and 14 are when we see those secondary scabs forming and filling in. And then we found that the wounds took 14 weeks to reach that re-epithelialized stage. And finally, to actually reach that very thin scar line, we found that it took about 15.2 weeks to fully contract. And I also want to note that these are some pretty preliminary results, as I'm actually still collecting data. I applied paste between June and October, and I still have about 6 calves that are not fully healed. So overall, these wounds are taking a pretty long time to heal. Especially when we compare that to hot iron disbudding, which, just to remind you, remember the multiple studies found that it took between 7 and 9 weeks for those wounds to re-epithelialize. So when we put those side by side, there's kind of 2 big picture things that I think we should take away. And the hot iron is being depicted in green, and the paste is being depicted in white. So the first big takeaway thing that I think we should consider is that kind of second stage where that burned tissue is trying to detach and come off of the calf's head takes much, much longer for the caustic paste. The second thing that I think is really important to take away from this comparison is that this whole process takes twice as long compared to the hot iron. And obviously, this is not a completely perfect apples to apples comparison, but based on what is currently available, we see that the process takes twice as long. We also see that the paste wounds take a really long time to heal on commercial farms. So based on some farms that I've visited in California, we've seen farms that are using paste and applying it within the first 3 days of life, that their weaned pens have pretty variable stages of healing from the paste. So you can see these 2 different girls still have that kind of crusty, initially burned tissue attached to their head, and that they're pretty sunken. There were some calves in this weaned pen that were healed, but overall, it seems that they take a very long time to heal, both in a research setting and in a commercial farm setting. So our takeaway for caustic paste is that the wounds take 15 weeks to heal. And I want to note that there has been some research that looks at caustic paste being perceived as less painful by producers and veterinarians. So based on a survey, they asked these individuals how they perceived the calf's experience for these 2 methods of disbudding. And overall, paste was ranked as less painful, but we truly don't have evidence for that. There have been very limited amounts of research that compare both hot iron and caustic paste, and the research that is available comparing the 2 are not conclusive. So one study showed that there was a lower stress response after hot iron disbudding, but the procedures between paste and hot iron were done at different ages. Another study showed that calves disbudded with hot irons shook their heads more in the first 4 hours compared to paste. But overall, the research that's available comparing the 2 is either contradictory or not a true apples to apples comparison. So we need a lot more research to truly identify if one method is either better for the calves or less painful for the calves. So as we kind of come to the last few minutes of our time together, I want to highlight some considerations for best practice. And there's kind of 2 key things that I think we should be thinking about. First, which method should we use? And then second, what pain relief we should provide. I just talked to you a whole bunch about different methods, and we don't have a conclusive result, right? So based on what our currently available tools are, farms can either utilize hot iron or caustic paste. We don't have a suggestion of one being better than the other. So farms can use either of these tools. However, I think there is some things that can be highlighted regarding pain relief. So best practice for pain relief is to provide both a local block, such as lidocaine, and an NSAID, such as meloxicam. Obviously, pain relief should always be provided in consultation with your veterinarian, especially considering that in the United States, at least, meloxicam does need veterinary approval. So best practice is to provide both, though. And the reason is that a corneal nerve block can numb the horn for about 2 to 3 hours. And an NSAID reduces the inflammation in the hours after the procedure. And ultimately, combining both of these pain relief methods will create the greatest reduction in signs of pain for the calves following disbudding. And this is based on the tools that we currently have available. However, as we saw earlier, not a lot of farms that are applying paste are actually providing any form of pain relief. And one of the reasons that I think this might be is surrounding the corneal nerve block. So as we saw, it's perceived that paste is actually less painful. And so that's probably leading to farms providing less of it, right? I also think that there's some less obvious feedback based on corneal nerve blocks being effective or not, or that the calves actually need them, right? So this is a little bit anecdotal, but I was recently talking to a veterinarian who said that they never checked if their lidocaine blocks were effective before they performed the disbudding procedure. So they were utilizing hot iron disbudding. They would give the lidocaine, and then they knew if the lidocaine was effective or not based on if the calf reacted when they actually applied the iron. And in that situation, you get some pretty immediate feedback when you do the procedure of if your lidocaine is working, right? However, for paste, because those behavioral responses, like that head shaking that I showed earlier, is delayed by a few minutes, I think that we're not actually seeing that same response. So probably you have 8 million things to do right on your farm. So you're applying the paste and you're walking away. You're not necessarily hanging around to see, oh, are my calves reacting to my paste? And if you are, great. I would love to hear more about what you're doing because I think that's super important. But one thing that we can do to help make sure that we're reducing the most amount of pain for the calves is to actually check that our blocks are effective prior to applying paste or an iron. And so one thing that I do is I will actually check for sensation prior to any form of disbudding. So whether I'm doing a hot iron or I'm applying paste, I will check to make sure that my nerve block worked. And how I do that is I use a needle to gently prick around the calf's hornbed and look for some sort of reaction. So as you can see in the first hornbud, the calf is not reacting at all, despite the needle gently being pricked. This is what we want to see, and this is what we should see, and indicates an effective block. However, if we see her pull away like that, that tells us that she's not fully sensitive, and we should probably provide a little bit of additional pain relief. And so looping back to our overall considerations for best practice, farms can choose to either utilize hot iron or caustic paste as their primary tools for disbudding. But for pain relief, we should provide both a corneal nerve block and meloxicam to calves. And this is regardless of the method of disbudding that you're using and regardless of what age you're performing it at. Farms also have the option of utilizing a sedative, but for time's sake, I'm not going to go into that. And if it's something you're interested in, again, just consult your veterinarian. So hopefully the key points that you're taking away from my talk today is that disbudding is painful for calves, regardless of the procedure and the method that you're using to do that. These disbudding wounds take a really long time to heal. It takes between 7 and 15 weeks across the two methods that I discussed. And then finally, pain relief should be provided for calves, and best practice is to combine both an NSAID, such as meloxicam, in combination with a local block, such as lidocaine. And I've included a slide that has some resources to employee training for disbudding and providing pain relief. So feel free to check those out.
So with that, we will say thank you very much to Alycia, and we will move on to our next presentation. So our next talk is Dr. Trevor DeVries. He's a professor at the University of Guelph in Canada and Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare. And today, Trevor is going to be talking to us about transition cow welfare.
Thanks very much to you and the team for inviting me and to present on this topic area. It's a pleasure. And what we're going to talk about is specifically, as the title suggests, transition cow welfare and challenges and opportunities that we have in that. And specifically think about, okay, why there might be welfare challenges, and then some practical take homes about what we can do concerning those from a management standpoint. When we talk about transition cow welfare, I think it's important for us to consider the question of what we mean by welfare. And animal welfare and welfare of dairy animals specifically can mean a lot of different things to different people. For many of those who might be watching this, dairy producers particularly, top of mind when they think about welfare is the biological function of the animal. So is that animal healthy? Is that animal productive? And definitely that is a component of welfare, that obvious function of that animal. However, we know that there are other aspects of welfare that we need to think about and consider. And beyond just how that animal functions and the health of that animal, we have to think about the affect of the animal, which is really the feelings of the animal. And so when we think about that, we think about the feelings of the animal, so to speak. We think about negative feelings, so things such as fear, pain, stress, distress, as well as potentially also positive aspects of affect as well, which is a little bit less studied, but definitely something that more and more people are thinking about and paying attention to. And then the third aspect of welfare that is often considered or thought about is the behavior of the animals, and specifically whether or not animals are able to express natural behavior. And probably most importantly, behaviors that those animals are highly motivated to perform. And so in consideration of that, we think about, the time budgets of animals. Are they able to devote enough time to doing the things that they want to do, eating, drinking, lying down, and as well as specifically behaviors that they may be highly motivated to perform as well, and including other things like grooming and various other potentially even social behaviors that those animals may be motivated to engage in. Now, when we think about these things, as I mentioned before, often say for dairy producers, the health and function of the animal is really top of mind. And obviously, so from that perspective, it is something that we need to focus on, but we can't ignore the other aspects of welfare, as generally the other stakeholders within the industry, and particularly say the consumers of dairy products, are going to be as concerned about those aspects of welfare, if not even more so. And so when we think about welfare, we need to look at it from kind of these three lenses and make sure that we're addressing all three, and we're not ignoring, say, any one component of that. When it comes to transition cow welfare, I think it's actually a really interesting dynamic in that these three are probably more interrelated at that time period than in any other kind of phase of production. And specifically, we know that any particularly, say, health challenges that dairy cows face during that time period are going to have direct impacts on, say, their affective state. And so those health challenges may be associated with pain and discomfort, and so directly affecting the affective state of those animals, as well as potentially their behavioral patterns and their time budgets. While at the same time, we know that those things in themselves, so negative affect, stress, distress, fear, those things, as well as, say, alterations to the natural behavior patterns of those animals, to the time budgets of those animals, can have a negative impact on their health and can actually lead to negative health issues as well. And so it does become a little bit circular, but it also points to the fact that we need to look at these things from kind of all angles and look for opportunities within, again, all three areas when it comes to trying to not only identify risk factors, but identify opportunities for minimizing the risk of welfare challenges during that time period. Now, again, health issues are top of mind, and I think that's why we often think about it in relationship to transition cows and the fact that maintaining good health in early lactation in our dairy industry continues to be a challenge, on many fronts. And this is just a summary of some data that was put together by Ruan Daros, who, while at the time doing his PhD here in Canada, summarized some of the available literature that we have, showing that we have high incidences and prevalences of some of these different infectious and non-infectious type conditions in early lactation, anywhere from almost 14% up to 40% incidence, with huge variability and range across different herds. And so what that points us to is the fact that we do have challenges, and even though we have made improvements in a variety of fronts when it comes to these conditions and others, they still do remain a challenge within the industry. This is some older data that actually was summarized by Dr. Jose Santos from University of Florida from 7 herds in the US and a database of almost 6,000 cows. And what's interesting about this is the fact that they demonstrate or show here that the prevalence of cows remaining healthy through the first 60 days postpartum was only 56%. So 44% of cows succumbing to one or more disease, 17% actually succumbing to more than one. And you can see the variety of different health conditions that contributed to this data set. And so that's a significant proportion, closing in on half the animals succumbing to some kind of condition in early lactation. And in the case of this data set, what they demonstrated was negative effects on the reproductive success of those animals, particularly when those animals had, say, more than one disease condition. And so obviously, any health challenge in early lactation is a concern. And just some more data to really highlight that. This is some data put together by one of our grad students here at the University of Guelph, Murillo Carvalho, was published 2 years ago, again, using a database from nearly 7,500 cows from large US dairy, whereby they looked at cows that either had no clinical disease, one clinical disease in the first 3 weeks post-calving, or multiple. And what you see here is that those animals that incur one or more disease have lower production. And so not only a direct impact that way, but those animals have less reproductive success. They're less likely to be enrolled for breeding. And as a result of that and other potential effects, not calve again and also be culled from the herd. And so these kind of issues, any disease incidents basically in early lactation, are not only directly impacting, say, the welfare of the producer, so to speak, particularly from an economic standpoint, but also from that animal standpoint in terms of her at simply not only the conditions she may be facing at the time and the direct implications of that, but even from, or also from a, say, a longevity standpoint and the risk of that animal leaving that herd early in life. One of the things that we know specifically when it comes to health challenges in early lactation in dairy cows is that those are often related to the intake of the animals, the behavior of the animals, as well as the body condition of those animals during that time period. And I like to point this out because these are kind of core things that we know. And so over the years, we've seen a lot of studies similar to what I have here on the screen, whereby when we look at, say, the dry matter intake, the amount of feed that those cows are consuming in the early lactation period and close-up period prior to calving, what you see is that those cows that remain healthy through the transition period have very consistent feed intake or feed consumption patterns, whereby those cows that succumb to some kind of illness, in this case, subclinical ketosis post-calving, are demonstrating reductions in dry matter intake, not only at the point of diagnosis, say here early lactation, but already in that prepartum period. And again, there's risk factors for that, but that drop in intake can be a risk factor for those postpartum conditions. And so anything that we can do to mitigate that risk of that animal dropping in her intake during that time period can have a substantial impact on reducing the risk of health conditions in those animals in early lactation. Similar to that, and probably related to that, we see associated, say, changes in the behavior of those animals. And so this is one of our studies whereby we looked at the rumination time of the cows, so the chewing time of those cows across that transition period as well. And similar to the previous graph, what you see here is that those cows that remain healthy are much more consistent. They do experience a drop in rumination right at the day of calving, but they show much more consistency in that time spent ruminating, as opposed to those animals that, in the case of this data set, developed ketosis as well as another health disorder. You see their rumination time drop and remain lower in that postpartum period when the health of those animals was affected. Now, this drop in rumination might be tied to dry matter intake, as you saw in the previous graph, and that's definitely a possibility. The other thing that we know is that behaviors like rumination are also systemically affected by other things. And so various impacts and stressors on those animals might actually reduce their rumination time, which might actually lead then to a drop in dry matter intake. And so again, making sure that those animals have the time and opportunity to develop or to devote to these kinds of behaviors is hugely important, and maintain those time budgets on those for maintaining health in and around this time period. Another example of this, and this is an older example, but some data again from Canada, whereby they looked at the standing and lying behavior of cows in and around the transition period, and then followed those cows out to mid-lactation. And what they demonstrated in the case of the study is that those cows that developed foot lesions and manifested in terms of lameness in those cows in mid-lactation, those cows actually were spending more time perching with 2 feet in their stalls in and around that time period of calving. And so in the 2 weeks before calving, those cows were spending more time with 2 feet in their stalls. So an alteration to those cows' time budget in and around the time of calving had a long-lasting impact on those animals in terms of their health. And so again, making sure that cows can devote the time they need to obviously standing when need to, say when eating, but also maximizing the amount of time that they spend resting and lying down. It's going to have huge dividends from or translating into health of those animals as well. Another area that is and continues to be a focus of a lot of research is the nutritional status of those animals, and specifically the body condition of animals in and around the dry period and transition. And one of the things that we know is that body condition loss occurs in many cows, and that body condition loss is often associated with negative energy balance, systemic or a high level of inflammation, which then often manifests itself into either infectious or metabolic transition cow diseases. And one of the things that we know is that those cows that lose a lot of body condition are the ones that often have too much body condition to start with. And so going back in time right to dry off, we know that those cows that say dry off at a high body condition or maintain high body condition through the dry period are going to be more likely to actually have, say, less feeding time, less dry matter intake, and actually be at more risk for fat mobilization and body condition loss. And so obviously a huge impetus there to manage those animals well from a nutrition standpoint, going back into the previous lactation, drying off cows at a good body condition, maintaining good body condition through the dry period. But also think about other impacts that might be happening therein as well. And we have some really neat data actually that suggests that there are probably other things going on in those animals that are affecting their physiology and say their subsequent health and early lactation. And we did this in a study that was published last year, whereby we took data from a variety of studies that we'd previously completed and looked at how the dry matter intake level of the cows varied based on their body condition, both in the far off and close up period, whereby we actually demonstrated very similarly that cows that were normally conditioned versus those that were over-conditioned or fat, those cows that were over-conditioned had lesser dry matter intake. And we see that consistently across the dry period, and particularly in this close-up period where you see a steeper decline in those cows' dry matter intake level. And which, again, going back to what I previously mentioned, is a known risk factor then for early lactation problems. And obviously then, again, suggestion that we need to be careful of the condition of these animals and maintain good nutrition practices to minimize risks associated with that. However, what was interesting in the study is that when we looked at those animals that were over-conditioned who subsequently lost more condition at calving, we then looked at whether or not that loss in body condition was simply related to their level of feed consumption or due to maybe other factors. And what we found was that the change in body condition, which is primarily a loss in body condition in those cows in early lactation, was only partially mediated by dry matter intake during the dry period. And what that suggested was that there was a large proportion of that kind of predicted loss in body condition was due to other things other than simply the nutrient consumption levels of those cows during the dry period. And so that raises a question as to what are those other mechanisms at play during that time period. And again, it could be a whole bunch of different things. However, one of the things that we do know that can play, and particularly to the welfare of cattle in and around this time period, is the level of stress that those animals are exposed to and various stressors that they may be exposed to during that time period. And particularly, we know that chronic stress or exposure to various stressors chronically is going to have not only potentially negative immediate impacts on the affect of that animal and how that animal perceives its environment, et cetera, but also physiologically. And so in those animals exposed to chronic stress, we know that there's risk of chronic systemic inflammation, which then is associated with greater risk of infectious and metabolic disease and impaired production and reproduction. And we see, again, evidence of this in the scientific literature and various studies that have been done. This is some data that comes out of a study from Dr. Julie Huzzy, who, while collecting this data, was doing her PhD at Cornell. And what Julie demonstrated in the case of this study, and again, just to simplify this really for you here, those cows that either had one health disorder or more than one health disorder after calving versus those cows with no health disorder, the NDI, basically those animals not only demonstrated pre-calving higher indication of negative energy balance, as noted here with higher NEFA levels, but also indicators of inflammation and stress as measured through haptoglobin as a measure of inflammation, as well as fecal cortisol levels as an indicator of stress in those animals. And so definitely a link between all those things, indicating that, again, that there could be a role of stress influencing inflammation and potentially leading to negative energy balance and other issues in those animals. And subsequent to that, Julie also published one other study with another data set showing then the negative effects of that stress in terms of early lactation production, whereby those cows with high levels of fecal cortisol in the weeks before calving, as you see here in the black bars, these are multiparous cows, so second and greater lactation animals, showing reductions in milk production in early lactation as opposed to those cows without as high levels of fecal cortisol pre-calving. And so again, suggesting that any level of stress may have a negative impact on those animals in early lactation. So that's kind of the case, I guess, for why various challenges to those animals are concerning to us, and particularly some of those welfare challenges are a concern. The question is, what does that mean in terms of optimizing the welfare of those animals during that time period? And again, in interest of time, the two things I want to talk about here today are, number one, minimizing stressors that directly impact the behavior and the affect of cows in and around that time period, as well as the potential for monitoring for behavioral changes and using that information from a management perspective. And so first off, looking at minimizing stressors, the three things that I kind of want to go through and look at examples of are managing housing and nutrition to allow cows, say, to display proper behavior, so express that natural behavior, proper time budgets, reducing social stress on those animals, as well as minimizing other stressors, including those that are, say, environmental. When it comes to maintaining good health, as I mentioned before, one of the keystones to that is actually simply maintaining good dry matter intake levels in cows. And obviously, if cows can't maintain proper dry matter intake of a balanced ration, that's going to lead to challenges in those animals in early lactation. And not only does that apply to lactating cows, but as much, if probably not even more so, to dry cows. And so again, just proper feeding management in terms of ensuring cows have feed available to them, that feed is pushed up, is going to go a long ways in terms of making sure that those cows can maximize their intake level, but also at the same time display good behavioral patterns at the same time, because we know that, for example, in both these situations here, in either situations where cows don't have feed or they have to wait for that feed to be pushed up, we see them change their time budgets, whereby they spend less time lying down, they spend more time standing and actively. They do change their intake pattern when they do actually get fed, all to kind of the negative. We also see the same thing when cows have to compete for access for feed. And so, again, we know that that can directly impact not only the eating patterns of cows, but can also directly impact how much feed those cows do actually consume at the end of the day. And probably across the literature, as well as anecdotally, we know that the feed consumption levels of cows are probably most influenced by something like feed bunk competition in and around that transition period. And we see examples of that. This is, again, an older Canadian study, but just a clear example of how in that transition period, competition for feed access can have a very stark negative impact on the level of dry matter intake of those cows, whereby those cows that have to compete for feed access are consuming less feed, which again, we know is going to be a risk factor for those animals succumbing to both metabolic and infectious problems post-calving. And so out of that, we have this recommendation that, dry cows, and particularly, as well as fresh cows, need sufficient space at the feed bunk to be able to optimize their intake level. And generally, that's looking at about close to 30 inches or more per cow. The other aspect of space is also allowing those cows to lie down when they want to. And again, hugely important from a time budget perspective, being able to allow those cows to rest adequately, keep them off their feet. When they're resting, they're going to be ruminating more, which we know then also contributes to a quicker digestion and a quicker return to eating. And so anything that's going to impede those animals from spending as much time lying down, whether that's in a pack situation like you see here in this picture, or in a freestall scenario, that's going to have an impact on their time budget. And we know that when cows don't have enough, say, for example, space during this time period, not only at the feed bunk, but even from a lying behavior perspective, we then see negative repercussions of that. And this is, again, an example from one of our studies, and there's been others similarly showing that when we do crowd those animals, particularly in the week before calving, in that close-up period, that is associated with greater risk of postpartum health conditions. And in the case of this study, we saw that every increase of 5% in stall stocking density was associated with a 10% increase in subclinical ketosis risk. And so minimizing stocking density, maximizing the amount of space available to those animals is hugely important for minimizing, say, some of those risks, not only just on the intake, but also on, say, the stress level of those animals, their social interactions, etc., to allow those cows really to optimize their time budgets. So practically, again, just some recommendations here and things to think about. What should we be striving for? When it comes to stocking density, we're looking at, say, less than 100%, ideally close to 80% at the free stalls. That's more so to allow for that sufficient bunk space for those animals, because generally, if we're down at that 80%, we have the recommended amount of bunk space, which we see here down below at about close to 30 inches per cow. If those animals are in pack pens, we're looking at a minimum of 120 square feet per animal. and closer to 150 square feet per animal for those animals that are, say, kept in pens where they're also calving in to give them sufficient space to do that as well. And then finally there, I didn't talk about the importance of that, but I think that's something that is often overlooked, is sufficient water space. Even though cows only spend a few minutes drinking per day, that drinking time is centered around very specific times of the day. And so we need to make sure that there's nothing hindering that animal from consuming enough water. And so a minimum of 4 inches of water space per cow per pen in more than one location per pen, regardless of even if it's a small pen with very few animals. Another aspect related specifically to the social behavior of cows is how we group cows in and around that time period. And and specifically the group composition when it comes to parity of those animals. And again, I think this is something that we know in the industry. We know that the behavior of, say, our first lactation heifers is different than our mature animals. And for the most part, the industry has adapted to that. We see that largely in our lactating pens. We see our first lactation animals separated from those older animals. Doesn't only allow us to, say, manage those animals differently, but from a social interaction, from a stress standpoint, it appears to have benefits for those first lactation animals, not necessarily for the older animals, but specifically for those first lactation cows. Where we do still see some challenges is applying that even prepartum. A lot of the larger dairies are able to successfully do that, but what we see in a lot of, say, small to medium-sized dairies, not only here in Canada, but I see it in the across the US as well, is that we still see a lot of situations where those animals do get commingled prior to calving in, say, close-up pens before maybe even getting separated out post-calving. And the challenge with that is that we definitely then see negative impacts on the behavior of those animals in those pens. And this is just an example of that from one of our studies from a few years ago, where we see that primiparous, so the PP, or first lactation animals that are commingled with MP, which are multiparous or second and greater lactation animals, we see them actually, particularly during this close-up period, demonstrating less lying time and reciprocally more standing time than those multiparous cows, even though those cows actually should be lying down more because they're eating less and they have less demand to actually be on their feet. And so in the case of this study here, we can likely just attribute that to the social dynamic of that pen and the impact that it has on those animals as they're mixed into, say, close-up pens. They've never been exposed to multiparous older animals. And so definitely there is benefit to separating those animals, not just postpartum, but probably even more so in that prepartum period. And we see the benefits of that. And there's data to suggest that when we do separate those first lactation animals from the mature cows, we see better access to resources. They lie down, they eat more. And as a result of that, there's a potential for more milk and less disease events in those animals. If we can't do that, and there are, again, situations, smaller farms where the housing resources or the way the farm is set up doesn't allow for that, then adequate space becomes even more important for those animals to be able to separate, to minimize that stress that might be on them related to those social dynamics in those pens. Another I guess, necessary evil, so to speak, that we think about when it comes to transition cows is the amount of times that animals are moved or regrouped. And one of the things that we know is that any regrouping or movement event for an animal does create a stress. And there's lots of studies to suggest that. That stress is often then manifested in terms of a change in time budget of those animals. And then also we see physiological effects of those things. And this is an example where we see animals that are either moved into a new pen or remained in their own pen, but regrouped with other animals. in either case, we see a drop in rumination time. And that drop, interestingly, in rumination is actually a systemic effect, whereby that occurs even before a drop in intake. And so that drop may actually then precipitate into a drop in feed intake as, say, rumination decreases, the rumen slows down, and she's a little bit slower to return to eating. And so obviously, the more often these things happen, the more challenge it creates for those individual animals. And so our challenge when it comes to transition cows is, even though these things have to happen, we need to think about minimizing that in the way we design and set up our management systems, and then think about minimizing that risk for individual animals. So moving animals at quieter times of the day, potentially where, and again, some of the research would suggest maybe moving them in pairs or in smaller familiar groups, and that can potentially minimize some of those, some of the stress associated with that movement. Probably the most important time period to think about this and think about minimizing that stress is in and around the time period of calving. And I thought I'd throw this in because I think this is where we still see some issues on farms where they're not managing movement of animals in and around that a direct calving period very well, and we see results of that, including more dystocia and more stillbirths or perinatal mortality. And so what researchers have demonstrated is that if we are moving animals prior to labor, so in the days or weeks ahead of labor, obviously not an issue, or even right at immediate point of labor, so what we call stage 2 of parturition or labor, where basically that animal is in active labor. The calf is in the birth canal with feet basically coming through and visible. Then, say, doing just-in-time calving, moving that animal into a calving pen is okay. However, where we do see challenges is actually in that time frame ahead of that. So in the probably 6 to 8 hours, up to even say 12 to 24 hours leading into that active labor, if we start moving animals in and around that time period, we see longer durations of calving, more assistance needed, and higher risk of hard calvings, dystocia, as well as stillbirths. And so we really need to think about that when thinking about how we manage animals, if we're moving them or not. And if we're thinking about doing, say, just-in-time calving type protocols, are we actually doing those at the right times? The last stressor I want to kind of highlight here is heat stress. And again, in the middle of winter here now, when it's nearing 0 degrees Fahrenheit out here, at least where I am, it's hard to fathom, but we know that heat stress is a problem for cows. I took this picture in California in early spring, where it was probably only about 68 degrees Fahrenheit out, but these animals still are seeking shade and seeking protection from solar radiation. And we know that it doesn't take much for those animals to change their behavior in response to any type of heat load. And not only is that important for lactating animals, but we see the same thing for dry cows. We see them change their behavior, not only again in warm climates, but even in temperate climates like here in the Northeast, where we still experience high heat and high humidity in our summertime periods. And with those, we see changes in behaviors of cows. We see rumination time decrease, we see intakes drop. And obviously for transition cows, for those close-up cows, that's problematic as we've described before. But there is also beyond that even physiological effects that occur and changes. We see more inflammation in those animals. And as a result of that, we see more health challenges and more productive challenges in those animals if they face, say, heat stress during that close-up period. And as a result of that, there is benefits of keeping those animals cool. Just like our lactating cows, we know that cooling dry cows can have positive impacts. And this is, again, a study that was published over almost 10 years ago from Jeff Dowell's group in Florida, showing that consistently across studies, when we cool dry cows, we see positive impacts in terms of their milk production as they move into lactation. And the really interesting thing is that cooling doesn't necessarily only impact those cows or that heat stress during that time period, but it also has epigenetic effects on their calves. And so those calves that are born from cows that say are cooled during the dry period, those calves 2 years down the line actually, again, work out of Florida, demonstrating that those calves are going to produce more milk. And so not only a direct impact of, say, that heat stress on those pregnant cows during the dry period, but on the in utero calf that's growing within them. And so again, one other stressor that we need to really pay attention to and manage in our dry cows. Last thing I want to touch on here briefly, just in the last minute here or so, is monitoring for behavioral changes as well. So we know that obviously maintaining good behavior patterns is good for welfare and minimizing welfare challenges in cows. We can take advantage of that to some degree by monitoring that behavior on our farms. We have a lot of technologies available to us nowadays, more and more adoption of that, not only for reproductive purposes, but also for health monitoring purposes as well, whereby things like rumination time, activity monitoring, whether that's collar-based, neck-based, or neck-based, ear-based, or say leg-based type systems, we can use to monitor these things and say potentially early identify animals that might be succumbing to health conditions, whether again infectious, non-infectious problems, and we have lots of good examples of that. And what that's allowing us to do is focus on preventative health at the cow level, so making more timely and informed decisions, identifying cows that need attention on our farms. Beyond that, though, and I think this is where I urge producers to think about, is not only using it for that purpose, but also to potentially identify problems and changes within nutrition management and housing and the environment at a herd level. And so when we see at a herd level, say, activity or rumination time of cows change, can we link that back to, say, a change in housing or management or nutrition, and then modify based on that? And I think that's where we have additional benefit of this type of behavioral monitoring on our farms. And so that gets me to the end of my presentation. Just really quickly to wrap up here, health challenges of dairy cows at transition are a welfare concern. And I hope I've demonstrated that not only do they result from reduced welfare, but then it can also lead to reduced welfare. And I think that's why it's kind of a double-edged sword, so to speak, in that way. And we need to minimize the risk of those issues. Again, first and foremost, and we didn't have time to talk about that today, but proper nutritional management is key, obviously, during that time period. But then minimizing stressors that impact behavior and the effective state of cows, and potentially also then minimizing some of these risks by monitoring behavior and being able to use some of those kind of tools to make more and better management decisions to minimize some of those risks. And so with that, I'd like to thank various funders of a lot of the research I've shown here today, and thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Trevor. We go into our last presentation of the day. We have Dr. Kristen Gaddis. She's a geneticist at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, and she's going to be presenting some genetics updates.
So thank you so much, Lindsay and Casey, for the invitation to talk with you guys here today. I'm really excited to be able to talk about a genetics update and how genetics might fit into strategies to improve the welfare and sustainability in the dairy industry. So before diving straight into things, I thought we would start out with an outline of what I'll be covering today. To start with, just an introduction as to how genetics fits in with welfare and sustainability, including how the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding fits into that. And then I want to touch on some material about selection indices and specifically net merit, which will then flow really nicely into some discussion about recent welfare and sustainability traits that have been introduced in the past about 5 years. Then to wrap up, I'll touch briefly on some new traits that may be coming in the future, and doing a little bit of wrap up before doing my best to answer any questions that you might have. So this slide is really going to capture what I hope the take-home message is that you get from my presentation today. When we're talking about improving welfare and sustainability of dairy production, genetics is one tool that we have in our arsenal. So given that I'm a geneticist, I'm going to be biased towards that tool, but we really shouldn't disregard everything else going on. And especially given the presentations that preceded me, I think they made the really good point for changes in management and things that we can do for management to improve some of the health and welfare and sustainability. So one aspect, one example would be nutrition. So without sufficient nutrition, no animal is going to be able to achieve their full potential. Even with the best genetics, they won't be able to display those genetics and be the best performing animal that we want them to be. And then the other component, which is obviously very important given the talks, is the management aspect of the traits that we see. So for many of these traits, the health and welfare and sustainability traits, there's really a small proportion of the differences that we see in animals that we can attribute to their genetics. A lot more of this is going to be impacted by the management, by what's going on in the environment, and things like that. So it's very important to also, pay attention to the management and pay attention to the nutrition. But at the same time, genetics is an excellent tool because it allows us to make permanent and cumulative change. So genetic improvement that you'll be able to make will not just disappear if you decide to stop selecting for a particular trait for whatever reason that may be. And so that makes it a good tool to keep in our toolbox as we try to improve the welfare. So the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, or CDCB, fits into this by providing these tools that can be used for genetic improvement. So we're a nonprofit organization located in Maryland, and we're formally represented by 4 sectors of the dairy industry, which I've shown here on the right. So representatives from the Purebred Dairy Cattle Associations, National Association of Animal Breeders, the Dairy Record Processing Centers, and the Dairy Record Providers, or DHI associations, all contribute to the CDCB goals. Practically, we are responsible for the calculation and distribution of evaluations for dairy cattle in the US. So we also manage the storage of these data that go into the evaluations and house the largest cattle database in the world. These were previously tasks performed by the Animal Genomics and Improvement Laboratory of USDA, and you may have formally referred to them as the Animal Improvement Program Lab. And we continue to work very closely with them and have strong relationships with that lab, as they currently provide the majority of research and development for the products that CDCB produces. So to give you a more concrete sense of what all that means and what CDCB does, this slide provides some statistics from CDCB from the past year. So right now our database includes over 5.6 million genotypes, and actually I believe we're nearing the 6 million mark now. And the majority of those today belong to Holstein females, as you can see in this little chart here, that the majority are Holsteins, and then 91% of these genotypes are coming from females. We also store data from over 4 million cows throughout the United States that are belonging to DHI herds. And these data from these animals are going into the evaluation of 50 traits, including 21 health, fertility, and calving traits, and 5 production traits, 22 conformation traits, and 25 official genetic conditions. There are also 3 types of evaluations that we produce, including those calculated weekly for newly genotyped animals, monthly genomic evaluations, and then full evaluations 3 times per year that incorporate all new data, new genotypes, and international data. Every evaluation, there's over 13 million new records going into the evaluations. And as it stands, just recently, we have over 100 million lactation records going into the evaluations. With all of this information, we also publish 4 different selection indices, which is going to bring us to my next topic. So that is selection indices and specifically net merit. So I just mentioned that at CDCB, we provide evaluations for 50 different traits in dairy animals. So there are obviously many traits that have economic importance for dairy production, as well as welfare implications. This slide names just a few of those, such as production traits. We have milk yield, fat yield, production yield, somatic cell score. We have some type traits like udder conformation and feet and leg conformation. There are also reproductive traits, calving traits, health traits, calf related, as well as feed efficiency now. And the best way to incorporate all this information, because there's a lot of it, is through the use of a selection index. Each of these traits has a different economic value and a different genetic component. So how much of the differences we see in the animals can we attribute to their genetics? For example, production traits like milk yield or fat yield have a genetic component, or we would call heritability, of about 20%. If we compare that, however, to something like the health traits, their heritability is about 1 to 3%. So that goes back to management and nutrition having a much larger impact on some of these traits. In addition, combinations of these traits can also have antagonistic relationships with each other. So a common example would be milk yield and somatic cell score. Typically, if we're seeing increased milk yield, we also tend to see an increase in somatic cell score as well, which is not necessarily what we want. So with a selection index, we can account for those relationships and be able to identify the animals that have both higher milk yield or production, whatever your goal is, and also lower somatic cell score. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on one selection index, and that is lifetime net merit, because that is the one that is developed by researchers at USDA and published by CDCB. Net merit is an economic selection index that's used to evaluate the lifetime profitability of the dairy animals. There are several variations of net merit that can be used depending on your farm-specific production structure. If you're selling for cheese, there is a specific cheese merit index versus a fluid milk index, as well as the grazing merit index, or their general purpose net merit. Net merit is a research-based index, so all the values that are used in it are based on peer-reviewed research and current economic projections. And the process of updating and revising net merit is extremely thorough. It involves a number of steps shown here on the right in the diagram, and is reviewed by numerous groups of people, everyone from representatives in academia, to industry representatives, to producers themselves. Prior to releasing a new revision, we try to put out a lot of materials and information so that people know what changes are coming and what sort of impact those changes may have. So what do these updates include? Typically, they're going to update with the most recent economic projections, make some revisions as additional research comes out. But probably the most noticeable thing that people notice are when new traits are introduced. So this slide shows you a sort of evolution of net merit and even its predecessors, which only included production traits, going back as far as 1971. We can see in 1994, when net merit was first formally introduced, in addition to the production traits, we've also added the traits of productive life as well as somatic cell score. And then you can see as we progress all the way through 2021's revision of net merit, we add more traits typically every time. And a lot of those traits are going to be more related to welfare and sustainability. So as we go through time, we can see we have reproductive traits added, like daughter pregnancy rate, heifer conception rate, and cow conception rate. In 2017, cow livability was added, followed by in 2018, we had the health traits added. And then most recently, we had a group of 3 traits added related to both calf health as well as feed efficiency. So now we wanted to take that and kind of look at it in a more visual way, and maybe a way that's a little bit more easy to see kind of the evolution of net merit. I've broadly categorized the traits as production in red, health traits in blue, reproductive traits in purple, and type traits in the yellow or gold color. This gets a little trickier to define the traits into specific categories as we go on, but just bear with me. So we'll start in 1971 with PD dollars, where it only included production traits. And then MFP dollars also included just milk, fat, and protein. We see all the emphasis is on production at this point, until the introduction of net merit in 1994, where, like we said, we had the introduction of productive life and somatic cell score. In 2000, we had the introduction of type traits, or inclusion of type traits in net merit. In 2003 and 2010, there were revisions to include reproductive traits and calving traits. And we can see the shift in emphasis of net merit continuing, where these blue and purple and even the type traits are gaining emphasis versus the production traits. And if we keep going through time, we see those changes going on. We have cow livability that was introduced in 2017, the health traits in 2018, and then we get to the most recent version of net merit, which was released in August 2021 of last year. When we compare the initial selection index that we started with back in 1971 with today's net merit, you can see how far our selection goals or objectives have really evolved. We now have an index that still has a large emphasis on production. It's about 1/3, and since after all, that is what producers are paid for, is production. But we now also include focus on many traits related to fertility, health, and efficiency of the animal. So this latest revision of net merit, which was released with the August 2021 evaluation, incorporated 3 new traits. So the one receiving the largest emphasis was likely feed saved, which you may have heard about, but also included were early first calving, as well as heifer livability. With these additions to the net merit, selection goals have been expanded to include both the better health and growth of cows, as well as better feed efficiency of cows. However, much like with any other revision of net merit, the target remains the same, which is to identify those cows that will reach the maximum lifetime profitability. So now I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on the traits that have been incorporated into the net merit index across the past 5 years, as many of these have direct impacts on the welfare and sustainability of the dairy industry. So the first of those traits, which was introduced in 2017, was cow livability. And cow livability is the prediction of a cow's ability to remain alive while in the herd. Cows living longer in the herd lead to reducing the amount of replacement cows needed, and will lead to a more sustainable industry. But to distinguish how this is different from a trait like productive life, I have a quick example on this slide. So on the left, we have cow A, very creatively named. And let's say we decide to cull her for some particular reason and sell her for beef. And that results in some money coming back to the producer. On the right-hand side, we have also very creatively named cow B. And let's just imagine that something happens to cow B and it forces us to have to euthanize her, as opposed to being able to sell her for beef or some other purpose. So she's not able to bring in that income at the end. Even if they had the same productive life, if they were both in the herd producing milk for the same amount of time, cow A is returning some money at the end of that productive life, whereas cow B is not. So this is the difference from productive life that livability is estimating. And it's an important part. lost disposal income in the US has been estimated to cost approximately $670 million per year. So the next trait, or set of traits in this case, that were introduced were 6 health traits in 2016. So clearly these relate to improving an animal's welfare by improving their resistance to common diseases. CDCB introduced health evaluations for 6 of the most common and economically important health events encountered on the dairy farm, largely those transition diseases that occur. These included mastitis, metritis, displaced abomasums or DAs, ketosis, retained placenta, and milk fever. So they're included in net merit as a sort of health sub-index, like an index within an index, with the emphasis of each of those being shown on the right in the pie chart. From this, we see that mastitis receives the most emphasis at about 33%. But then we have a trait like DA, which receives almost a quarter of the total emphasis as well. And it's not because DAs are very common, like mastitis, but because of the large economic cost of a DA, it gets a larger emphasis. And this is due to the fact that it usually requires veterinary intervention and likely surgery. And then the other traits get varying amounts of emphasis, ranging from metritis at about 27% down to milk fever at around 2%. The data for these evaluations come from producers reporting events on farm and contributing to the national database. And this allows us to provide predictions for direct events that are not captured by other traits like livability. Currently, these evaluations are only available for Holstein and Jersey animals, but we are currently working to determine the feasibility of providing these evaluations for other breeds. So now we've discussed cow livability, but there is also a time period between what would be accounted for in a stillbirth evaluation and the trait of cow livability. So this time period of raising replacement heifers is a major cost in dairy production. The average cost of a lost heifer is approximately $500, with the most common reasons being incurring digestive or respiratory problems. The new heifer livability evaluation provides a prediction for this time period of how likely a calf will survive through the heifer period and make it to production. So selection for improved heifer livability should also reduce the incidences of the diseases like digestive and respiratory problems, and subsequently improve the health and welfare of calves and young stock. Another trait included in the most recent revision of net merit was early first calving. You can also think of it as age at first calving. Along the same lines of heifer livability, heifers are eating feed but not producing milk, aka income, until their first calving. It has been estimated that earlier first calving is worth approximately $2.50 per day per heifer. However, it is important to also note that this is a trait with an intermediate optimum. We don't want to push our animals too early in the calving or too late for calving. We don't want heifers that calve too late, since earlier calving was found to be associated with greater fertility and higher milk yield. But on the flip side, we also don't want heifers that calve too young and increase the likelihood of calving difficulties or stillbirth. So this really, again, emphasizes the importance of using an index. And by incorporating early first calving into an index that also accounts for calving traits like stillbirth and calving difficulty, we can balance these traits, and we can ensure that earlier first calving doesn't sacrifice increasing calving difficulty or stillbirth in our animals. So the last trait that I am going to go over, and last but not least, we get to our evaluation for feed efficiency, Developing an evaluation for feed efficiency was an important goal for us because feed is the largest single expense on a dairy farm. Additionally, animals that require less feed are more sustainable for a number of reasons. First, if they require less feed, less land is going to be required in order to grow that food in order to feed them. Second, if they are eating less feed, they are also less likely to be producing more manure, or so that's less manure for us having to manage. And last but not least, there is some evidence that by improving dairy animals' feed efficiency, we will also reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that they produce. And although this is still an area of active research. So the CDCB publishes the trait of feed saved as a measure of feed efficiency that accounts for two components. The first component is residual feed intake, or RFI, and this is a measure of how much a cow actually eats compared to what we would predict her to eat based on her size and her production levels. So an animal that eats less than what we would predict are the ones that we want to identify. This requires daily measurement of individual feed intake, as well as routine measurement of milk and component production and body weights, which makes it a trait for which data collection is labor intensive and very expensive. So this is why up until just recently, an evaluation for feed efficiency was not available and is only available now through the collaboration of several universities collecting these data as part of a national grant funded by the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and CDCB. In addition to RFI, feed saved also incorporates the trait body weight composite, which is an indication of the animal's body size. This is to account for the fact that larger cows must eat more in order to meet their maintenance demands, and also accounts for differences in things like rearing costs and salvage value. So these two traits combine, RFI and body weight composite, to give us our published trait of feed saved, which indicates the expected pounds of feed saved per lactation. Because we're reporting pounds of feed saved, we want larger positive values, so that indicates that the animal is saving us more feed. So that was a lot of material to cover on a large number of traits, and in truth, it's really just scratching the surface for most of them. If you are interested in more information on a particular trait, I really encourage you to check out our website where you can find individual information sheets for many of these traits. The website I have listed here on this page, or if you just navigate to our homepage, followed by what we do, and then genetic evaluations, you should arrive at a page that looks similar to what I've shown here on the right. The trait calculation details are the links to the individual trait reference sheets, much like the one I've shown as an example for feed saved. So each of these sheets provides general information about the trait, how they're measured, how much data are going into them, how to use the evaluations, as well as some more specific details. So now, wrapping up, I have a couple of additional slides just to give you a preview of future traits that are currently under investigation or development to further address the needs to improve the welfare and sustainability of dairy cows. So to start with, as I previously mentioned when discussing the health traits, we are currently investigating the possibility of evaluating the health traits for additional breeds such as brown Swiss. Another aspect that we are involved in a project with the University of Minnesota to investigate hoof health and lameness, with the goal being to develop a genetic evaluation to improve hoof health and reduce lameness in dairy animals. And this includes working with hoof trimmers to collect detailed lesion data, as well as investigating the use of a video analytics platform that captures the animal's movement and mobility on a camera as they go through, to identify animals that have a mobility problem. They may need to be seen by the hoof trimmer. We can point out those animals and hopefully require less labor than having an actual human being identify those lame animals. A team is currently looking at the feasibility of having a milking speed evaluation. This is really at the early days. We're seeing what data is out there and how it might be able to be used. On the feed efficiency front, I mentioned that there is a grant going on to collect the feed efficiency data. That grant is ongoing. Researchers at 5 research institutions throughout the country are continuing to collect intake data and submit it to CDCB to be used in the evaluations. But at the same time, they're also investigating other traits, methane emissions, how we can use sensors to measure additional traits that could be used as a proxy for feed efficiency, and additional research to go into the feed efficiency evaluations. Last but not least, there's also ongoing research towards the development of a genetic evaluation for resistant Seone's disease. So here on this slide, I've really focused on potential new traits and largely those that either I or CDCB have a direct work on. But there's also constant work being done to improve other traits that are currently evaluated in order to provide the best evaluations possible. And as we've heard before, research going on throughout the country and the world in development of new traits that address welfare and sustainability for the dairy industry. So just to recap where we've been in the past half hour or so, however long it's been, genetics is a powerful tool to include in your arsenal for improving the performance and profitability of dairy cows, also improving the welfare and sustainability. We make the most progress when we use all the tools in our arsenal to their potential. So we have to use nutrition, genetics, and management synergistically together to get the most bang for our buck, so to speak. There are many traits that are now evaluated for dairy animals, from production traits to health traits to efficiency traits. And the best way to select for all of these economically important traits is through the use of a selection index. This will ensure that all traits receive the appropriate weight and emphasis while accounting for relationships between those traits. And lastly, improvements to current evaluations and development of new evaluations for new traits continues to occur. So with that, I have to acknowledge my colleagues at CDCB as well as Agile. A lot of this work has been done by them and just presented by me, as well as the FFAR and CDCB feed efficiency team, along with many other collaborators that help us get this research done. With that, I will wrap up. I thank you for sticking through it through the last presentation of the 3 days.
Great, thank you so much. With that, we'll say thank you to all of our speakers and to everybody for attending.